All right, so to kick us off, just a little bit of background. I thought, why don't you each tell us something a little bit about how you ended up in the career that you're in? And I think, this being WashU, I feel like maybe I've spent too long teaching business ethics this semester, but the pressing question is maybe like, why not finance? Why did you become a physician? Why positive psychology instead of where all the money is?
I'll let you go first.
Well, Tim, you'd probably tell us money doesn't make you happy,
I was about to say, actually, that's
right.
One of the lessons.
Yeah, so. You've got a graph in your book
I
about
do.
that.
Wow,
yeah.
You've already looked at the book.
Happiness 101, available for purchase. So I'm Lydia. Good to see you all. I'm a medical doctor, and as I was sharing with Nick over dinner, I never wanted to be a doctor, and I still don't, but it was something that was sort of inescapable. And maybe the best way to describe this is if you've ever had the strong sense that you were supposed to do something and you just couldn't get that thought out of your mind. That was sort of the sense that I had that drove me into medicine after 5 years of incessant sort of haunting that I was supposed to become a doctor. I finally gave in and went to medical school. And it's interesting. There's so many wonderful things about medicine. I hear there are a lot of doctors' kids at WashU and a lot of pre-meds. So maybe many of you have grown up in a medical world. I certainly did not, and I have been amazed to find medicine both more gratifying and more distressing, perhaps, than I could have ever imagined. But certainly in contrast to finance, every day and in clinic every 20-minute period of my day, I find that I am very directly having an impact on people's lives and hopefully, bringing them to a better spot, whether it's healthier or sort of more at peace or deeper understanding of their diagnosis or what have you. So it's really gratifying. And I'm at Columbia, so I get to teach, which is also incredibly rewarding. So I feel very grateful, perhaps not as wealthy as one could be, but very grateful to be where I am.
In terms of my path, I went to college at WashU a number of years ago. I was very undecided, did not know what I wanted to do. In fact, I even remember during orientation, they had these programs during the summer where you would come to campus for a weekend before the freshman year started. And there was a person I met, and we were exchanging schedules after we had signed up for our classes, and I saw that he was enrolled in introductory psychology, and I looked at it and I said to him, why would you want to take that? That does not look interesting at all. Now, never mind that is the class I now teach, but at the time I kind of had this misconceived idea that psychology was just lab rats and mazes and stuff like that. It wasn't until in my freshman dorm I overheard another student talking about the topics that they were covering in that course, and he was going into these studies about human behavior and human motivation and what could lead people to think and believe all sorts of things. And I just thought that was a really interesting topic, and that there was a field of study that dedicated itself to that. I thought was pretty cool. So even before I started taking the class, every time I would see him, I was like, it's covering psych today. Any new studies that you can update us on? And he finally said, why don't you just take the class, and then you can learn about all these things. So I took psychology, loved it, got to know my professors, ended up going to graduate school in psychology. How I ended up studying happiness also was sort of by accident. In my first year of grad school, I was getting burned out a little bit by all the statistics courses and just the grueling coursework. And so I started working in the Office of Residential Life on the South 40. And I began to notice that there were differences in how students were making their path through WashU. I mean, WashU is a highly selective institution. Everybody who's here had to meet a very high bar to be accepted here. But I noticed working with these first-year students that there was variability. Some students were really happy. They had a lot of friends. They were doing well in their courses. And other students were floundering. They were really struggling. They couldn't get their footing socially. They were doing poorly in courses, even though they had done well in high school. And I just became curious about that. I wanted to know, what is it that predicts whether some students are happy and successful and others are not? And I brought up those questions to my advisor in my graduate program, and essentially he said, well, the questions that you're asking really are psychological in nature, and there's this new emerging field called positive psychology that focuses on that. And I said, what the heck is positive psychology? And he said, well, let me show you. And he sort of opened the story, he said, read these articles, take a look at it, and the rest, as they say, is history. And now I teach a course on that topic because I had a good advisor who I think saw something in me and said, this might be something that you want to pursue. And it was really just those questions I had, that curiosity that motivated a program of research, and now has set me up for a career where I continue to investigate those questions and share what I know with others. And I look forward to hopefully having a chance to talk about some of those things tonight.
Excellent, thank you. So let's get to the big questions. For the first one, I want to start with a version of the question that is the title of this forum. So everyone probably saw the poster. What would you do if you had only 1 week to live? But I want to open this up a bit. So first of all, I don't think that there's anything special about a week. Could be a month, a year, 10 years. And more generally, of course, in the background of all of this is the fact that we all do, in fact, have only a limited amount of time. I think most of us don't know how much. Hopefully longer than a week, but it's limited. And so the general version of that question, temporally opened up, is how do you live your life knowing that you only have so much time? I also want to say that I don't think the question here is specifically about what the two of you would do if you discovered that you only had a week or a month to live. As I often tell my students about all of the questions we ask in my classes, this, like all of the philosophical questions that we talk about in philosophy, these are questions you have to answer for yourselves. So the position that we're all in is that we do, in fact, have to answer this, every single one of us. And I think what's unique about the two of you is that you have backgrounds and expertise and experience that puts you in a position to tell us quite a bit about what kinds of things a person, whoever they are, might want to be thinking about when they're thinking about these kinds of questions. And I think this can include whether it is only a week or a month or a year. And I think, Lydia, you have a lot of relevant experience about these kinds of things, more than I do, thankfully. And I think, Tim, you have a different kind of perspective on these kinds of questions about, I mean, one thing that I find sort of fascinating is the fact that it does seem to make a big difference how long it is. Lydia was telling me at dinner that there's a chapter of your book, which I only got yesterday, so I haven't finished reading it yet. And this is a late chapter about like asking or telling college students at a certain point, like, you're going to be done with college in 6 weeks. How do you feel about that? And I think it's sort of curious that there's such a difference between doing that with only 6 weeks left and doing it with like 6 months left or 3 years left. And, you know, I think you should both feel free to answer this question however you see fit given what you know, but those are some things that kind of occurred to me as I was thinking about the title question and sort of reading the beginnings of both of your books in the last day.
I'm so impressed you read that much of the book and then you just got it, so I just have to acknowledge that. That's pretty amazing. So.
Airplane ride.
Oh, airplane ride, all right, that's good. Well, so you kind of alluded to what I do with I just did this 2 weeks ago with the students. I remind them, and when I'm developing my positive psych class, I'll always sort of move around the topics, but the very first thing when I'm developing the course is I count 6 weeks from graduation day, and whatever that day is, that's when I develop that lecture on the time paradox and how our interaction with time and how we savor time depends on the knowledge of the impending end of something. And there's researchers who have done this. And I think that it's important for us to acknowledge the impermanence of life. Anytime that we recognize that what we have is not going to last forever, although it can be difficult to internalize that, we also know that just from like an economic perspective, the reason why when you go onto Amazon, they'll say only 3 of these things remaining is because when something becomes a scarce resource, its value increases. And marketers know that, which is why they often use that kind of language when they're trying to sell us a product. But it's also the case that in our own lives, when we become aware of our impermanence, at least on Earth, that changes how we interact with things. It puts things into a proper perspective. So that's the reason I do that activity, and I always get mixed reviews. This year, I see a couple of the students in the class, they were actually like, thank goodness, only 6 weeks. But some years, the students have been like angry. One year, a student said, I hate you. And I was like, did someone just say I hate you? And the student said, yeah, I did. And I was like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. So this is just a fact. I think, though, that for me, I mean, I try to live my life in a way where none of us are promised tomorrow. So, I try to be mindful of that. Am I always mindful of that? Of course not. But I think that if I only had a week left, I would want to spend as much time as I could with my loved ones, and I would probably spend a lot of time writing gratitude letters to people who had impacted me, and let them know how much they mean to me. But when I reflect on that, I'm also grateful that that's not too different from how I actually live my life. I think that that's one of the things I try to do anyway. I have not recently been given a terminal diagnosis, but I regularly write gratitude letters to people who have had an impact on me. One of the most important people in my life passed away last fall, unexpectedly, and I was heartbroken by it, but I took solace in knowing that there was nothing left unsaid, that he was actually my mentor in graduate school, hugely influential in my life. But as sad as I remain that he's no longer here, I regularly let him know how much he meant to me and how influential he was in my life. And so I try to incorporate that into my living. So I think I would probably heighten that a little bit more. I probably, wouldn't be going into work that week. I'd be, writing gratitude letters and spending time with my buddies. But I try to do that anyway. And I think that that's how I try to live. I think there's a song about that, live like you were dying. I don't embody that song perfectly, but I do try to spend time with people, prioritize relationships, and express gratitude to those who have been impactful in my own life.
Yeah, that's great. When you opened up the question, Nick, from 1 week to just sort of recognizing that we're mortal, it's really easy, I think, then to lose perspective, right? The 1 week really brings things into sharp focus. Okay, the clock is ticking, it starts now, what am I gonna do, right? To whom am I going to express gratitude? Who do I want to be with? What do I want to read? How do I want to spend my time? The minute you sort of make it indefinite, I think it's really easy to lose track of the fact that we all face our finitude. And this is something I see all the time in the clinic and in the hospital, right? Patients who are well aren't often thinking about their mortality. They just aren't, right? It's something that isn't perhaps the most pleasant thing to dwell on. And frankly, people want to just think about their living. And I would hazard a guess that that's true of most college students as well. Then the fatal diagnosis, the terminal diagnosis, the scare can change everything. I gravitate towards Tim's perspective, but for different reasons. My reasons are more related to having so many patients my age, having cared over the course of the past 20 years for so many patients my age who have received these terrible diagnoses. And I think, well, why is it me sitting here as the doctor, healthy, and you, my same age, as the one who's now facing his death, right? Why is it that we're on opposite sides of this table, and yet it could have been different? And in light of seeing so much death and sickness and death, that kind of prompted me then to think about, how do I want to live with intention, right? So how do we live with an eye to our mortality, with an eye to our finitude, without getting sort of obsessed and caught up in the morbid aspect of death, but doing it in a way that allows what's most important to us to come into relief. And I think that's what you characterized. So if it's more than a week, can we still live as though it were a week? And what would that look like? I think it's a challenge, but I also think it's a practice that all of us can habituate ourselves to, that we can get into the habit of thinking about what matters most and how will we really live each day, let those people know each day, engage in the tasks of living well in a way that that makes the most of the time that we have. So I think it's pretty similar to what you said, Tim.
And I think you used a really important word there, that we habituate. I mean, when you look at the science of happiness, there's a term that we use, hedonic adaptation, but it's that we very quickly and easily adapt to what we have, and we very quickly and easily take for granted what we have. And I think included in that can be time, that we take that for granted. And sometimes it is those reminders that are unexpected that sort of force us to confront the reality that there's nothing that's guaranteed, that we can't take things for granted because nothing really is.
Yeah, and I think, you might say, Nick, that the ancients, one of the things they were about was cultivating the virtues, right? So habits or habituating is another way of describing cultivating a virtue of gratitude, of living with intention. I don't know if you want to expound on that, but.
I do have a sort of follow-up question that ties into really nicely. When I was in graduate school, I spent a kind of enormous amount of time thinking about this concept from Aristotle. The Greek word is energeia, which is the source of our word energy. But it seems to mean in Aristotle, at least according to my teachers, something like activity, where the idea of this seems to be that an activity in this sense is the kind of thing that can never be completed. So it's contrasted in the usual vocabulary with a process, which is the kind of thing that is progressing towards some goal, where once you've gotten to the goal, you're done. And one of the things that Aristotle seems to think is that life is an activity in this sense. In particular, living well. And I think when I teach ethics, I sometimes talk about this, that happiness is not the kind of thing where you work for a while towards it and then you get there and then you're done. And you're just I'm happy now. What shall I do next? It's a thing that you are constantly engaged in. And so living a happy life for Aristotle is part of doing things happily. And I have a question about what this means in connection with something that you both said about, I think I'm gonna give the cliche version of this, which is live every day like it's your last. Because I'll confess that I have always kind of hated this as a way of thinking, but it occurs to me that maybe I just misunderstood it. Because one way of hearing it, it's well, I'm not going to worry about things like making money. I don't even really have to worry about eating anymore. If I've only got a day, I can throw caution to the wind and do all these things. But obviously, if I'm going to live more than one day, that's not smart. So in practice, I just it's not wise to live every day like it's your last. But another way of thinking about this that was suggested to me, I think, by things that you both were saying is that, and I think this would fit with Aristotle's idea of an activity, what if you could arrange your life in such a way that, were you to discover that you were going to die in a week, you didn't have to change anything? That the way you were living your life was one where the thing to do, knowing you had only a week left, was exactly the thing you were already going to do. And it strikes me that if you're doing that, then you're living the good life. You're doing it right.
Yeah, I would say, I can't speak for Tim, but I think I'm going to speak for Tim too. I think that's what we were both saying. The second, not the first. Maybe I'll just riff off of that for a quick second and say that in my work, I was really interested. So I've had all of these patients die these sort of terrible deaths. Their family members have come back to me and said, the way our mother died in the intensive care unit is something we never want to see again. That was terrible. Family members saying, she wasn't ready, she never made her peace. I've heard statements like this so often. And so that, for me, even as a medical student, got me thinking about why are patients dying so poorly? If you have your whole life to live knowing that you're going to die, why is it that people are not really facing up to their mortality over the course of their living? And so I sort of was wrestling with this as a medical student and then as a resident. And then I stumbled across this genre of literature called the Ars Moriendi. And this was Ars Moriendi is Latin for the art of dying. And it's a genre of literature that the premise of it was this. If you want to die well, you have to live well. That is, the art of dying and the art of living well are very much intertwined. So it's not so much like seize the day kind of mentality, throw caution to the wind, but let me live into the fullness of the life I want to live. Let me flourish today. Let me begin cultivating today the kind of character that I want to be known for when I die. Right? So in the late Middle Ages, when plague was sweeping across Western Europe, all kinds of people died sort of unexpectedly. And I guess we saw this a little bit in COVID, right? Not on quite the same scale at all. But when you have 1/3 or 2/3 of the population dying from plague, suddenly people are going to their deathbeds with a kind of character that was not at all how they wanted to be remembered. And that's what really triggered this genre of literature. You don't want to go down being known as an angry, hostile, greedy man, then think about what it means to be generous, to be patient, to be gentle, to be kind, and start cultivating today those sorts of character traits, those habits, so that you live that way, right? None of us is perfect. We fail all the time. We're constantly having to start again. But you live that way, and you make it a habit. You make it a pattern of life, so that in the end, when you die, you are that kind of person, even in your dying. And so I think I'm with you on the second option.
As you were saying that, it reminded me of something that another one of my mentors shared. So I've been at WashU for a long time because I was a student here, for both undergrad and grad school, and then this is where I've spent my career. So I've been at WashU for 22 years, and one of my mentors who's been consistent all 22 of those years is actually Father Gary Brown from the Catholic Student Center. And I remember that one of the things that he shared with me, because as a priest, he's often called on when people are in their final hour or they get the terminal diagnosis. Often people will go to a religious or spiritual leader. And so he's walked with people during their final weeks or months. And that's one of the things that he has emphasized. He says the way that we live is the way that we die. And I think that he's exactly capturing your sentiment there. And I don't mean to speak on his behalf, because I think that that phrase could be taken in many different ways, but I've heard him say it a couple different times in different contexts. And what I always took from it is that, yeah, it's the behaviors and the mindsets that we bring into our living, in the ups and the downs, that's part and parcel of our lives. Is just inevitably there are going to be good moments and bad moments, and the extent to which we're able to savor those good and even look for the silver linings and through the adversity, and also our ability to persevere and to keep going even when times are tough, and to have a robust social network that we can draw upon to be with us, that becomes especially salient in our final moments. And I think that to the extent to which we can incorporate those habits into our lives, when we don't have the diagnosis, eventually one day we will, and many of us will, and then it's important to, I think, know how to carry that into it when we are given, only so much time left for life. And that's one of the things that, people often ask, because I study happiness, they'll say, so what do I need to do to be happy? What's the secret to happiness? And I think that oftentimes people are looking for like a wow factor, some big splashy thing. But if anything, the wow factor is that there is no wow factor to happiness. It's not about, some big, huge vacation or the big salary or the title or moving into the big house, but it's really about the accumulation of those small, daily, I like the word to use, intentional behaviors that we incorporate into our living that over time contributes to a sense of well-being. And I think that we then have the potential then to bring that into, one day, for all of us, our dying.
And you, Nick, had asked, I think the second part of your earlier question was what sort of factors need to come into this conversation about living well at the end of life. I don't know how you exactly said it, but that's the way I remembered it. And you just brought up a couple of things, right? You brought up community, and I know that's something that both of us in our books talk about. The importance of community, and we were talking about this over dinner, the loneliness problem, the impact of social media. One of the things that I often tell people when I'm speaking about my own work is that central to living well and dying well is nurturing relationships. And sometimes I give people a thought experiment. I say, tell me who you would want at your deathbed. If you think about, you get the diagnosis and it's not good. who's going to be surrounding you? Almost everybody says they want to die at home surrounded by their loved ones. Most people actually don't die at home. But well, let's just go with that. You're at home surrounded by your loved ones. Who are those loved ones? What family members or friends are surrounding you? And then I ask people, okay, so what is the state of those relationships now? What are you doing to nurture those relationships? And one time a guy in the audience raised his hand and he said, well, I know who I want at my deathbed, I just can't stand the guy right now. Can I wait to work on that relationship? And you know, it's funny, it's a silly question though, right? Because none of us knows what day we're going to die. But how much stronger, how much richer, how much deeper will those relationships be at the end, whenever the end arrives, if we are intentional, right, about nurturing those relationships over the course of our living. And so certainly relationships are one, the habits, the character traits that we cultivate. And I would say, so I come at this in part from the Christian tradition, and one of the things that I think about both as a person of faith and as someone who has cared for many patients who are facing their deaths, and maybe your priest mentor also would have comments on this, is sometimes these religious questions come up for my patients. And, you know, I don't know what I believe. I've never really thought about it. I'm facing my death, and I don't know, you know, and it's sort of, well, it would be bad to say a Hail Mary to call the chaplain, but it's kind of a Hail Mary to call the chaplain, right? Somebody get this person help it, but my point in bringing this up is we think about what does it mean to live well in order to die well. Part of living well, I think, is attending to these questions while you're still able, because I've certainly cared for patients who were not able to think clearly at the end of their lives. So it's just good to wrestle with this stuff, and there's no better place than college, really.
I agree with all of that.
I feel compelled to make this extremely practical, if only for a moment. So we've talked now about like living intentionally in this way, thinking about all these things. But as I imagine a number of students are wondering at this point, and I wonder myself regularly, how do you actually do this when, say, you have a paper due tomorrow? And I think I mean this very seriously, because I think, you know, we get habituated into these ways of living that when we stand back and think about our deaths, we realize aren't actually how we want to be living. But at the same time, I think we all think like, I do actually have to write this paper. And so what do you do with that? And how do you avoid the letting the pressingness of those things you have to do, all of those deadlines, habituate you into forgetting about this? I know it's a hard question, but if you have any tips, I think that everyone in this room is all ears.
It is a hard question, and I think if you have a paper due tomorrow, you got to do your paper. I'm sorry, you can't be like, well, we attended a panel and they said that, you know, meaning of life stuff. So you got to do your paper. But what comes to mind for me, there's a quote from John F. Kennedy where he once said, "The time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining," and that I think that we have to call attention to the opportunities when it is most conducive for us to be developing those habits that in the long term are good for us. But we have to balance that with the reality of what is required of us right now. So earlier, you brought up a really good point of, you know, oh yeah, you should live every day like it was your last. No, you can't. Like, that's impractical. If I knew that today were my last day, you know what, or tomorrow's my last day, I'm not going into work. I got some people I need to hang out with. I got some food I need to try. Like, I've got stuff I need to do. I can't live every single day like that because, as far as I know, I'm going to be here for at least a little while longer, and so I've got some other things that require some long-term planning. And so it does require a balancing act. But yeah, if in the short term there's not much of an opportunity to develop habits, then you've got to take care of those things. But at some point, there will be an opportunity where you do have a chance to step back, reflect, and think, where am I putting my greatest time, effort, and energy? What is that leading to in terms of the big picture? And where do I have opportunities to start making some modifications with who I'm spending my time with and what I'm doing with my time. Where can I start to make some shifts that in the long term, for whatever time I have, it maybe is preparing me to have the relationships with the people who I'll want to have around me for the good and the bad and everything that might go along with it.
At Columbia right now with the medical students, we've been talking a lot about cultures that corrupt or corrode versus cultures that sort of nurture and build up. And medical training in particular is sort of a sustained mini hell, maybe you could put it that way, or it's a sustained period of really forcing you to surrender all of your attachments. I mean, it's really so all demanding. And what happens is a lot of people go through training and really lose many of the relationships dear to them. So, and I'm sure that that's true of other disciplines as well. I just happen to know medicine. And then you add to that sort of the way that healthcare is going, and it feels disheartening. And so what we've been trying to help the students do is learn to see the environments that they're in and to be able to name what is happening to them. And in that awareness, then also begin to formulate a way, cultivate the practices that will help them mitigate that sort of soul-sucking aspect of the training. If you don't see it taking over your life, it's hard to do anything about it. So that's why seeing the environment that you are in. So if you have a paper due tomorrow, but this is, your semester's finished in 5.5 weeks, you'll be okay. Just, take care of what you need to do. But if that sense of there's always a paper due and I can never come up for air and I can never relate to the people I love, if you start to see that that's the environment that you're in, you need to name it, and maybe that's not an environment to be in long term, or if it's the environment that you're in for your 7 or 9 years of medical training, you need to be aware of that so that you can figure out how to mitigate it, even if it's just quick fixes. So a quick phone call, a quick text, a quick meal, a quick way of connecting so that you don't lose your humanity. So that's, I say that's something that we've been trying to do, and I don't know that it fixes everything, but really cultivating these sort of eyes to see that the environments that we're in can be corrosive is really an important part of this.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a tiny bit, but I actually think that, so the second question that I had planned is a question about, in some sense, how to handle disagreement about how to live our lives. And I think this is obviously something that we're all going to face in talking about this with our friends, maybe later after this talk. And I think now, given what you were just saying, Lydia, I'm tempted to think of this in terms of like a matter of how to build cultures that support living well in the sense that we've been talking about, in a way that allows us to explore exactly these issues. So how do you create a culture in which people can talk about and explore these kinds of things, where the conversation doesn't have to get heated or turn nasty, but it's a way of like, hopefully exploring together how to figure out, I don't know, how we each should live. And I'll say, so one way that this comes up, I've been thinking a lot about this in teaching my business ethics class this semester. And I still don't know what exactly to make of some of the conversations that I've had with my students about, in particular, ethical relativism, which is the view that, there's different versions of it. The most familiar is perhaps that the way that people ought to act, the ways in which it's genuinely right for them to act, is relative to their culture. Okay, and philosophers generally tend not to be super sympathetic to this view because it seems to, in a problematic way, insulate everyone from any kind of criticism. A friend of mine who actually also teaches business ethics put this kind of nicely when he said, like, when he talks to his students about this, he points out that it may be tempting to go in for some kind of relativism with the thought that, like, you don't want to be telling other people how to live their lives. And there's something in it that seems right, that we don't want to be so confident that we're right that we just go around, like, telling everyone that they should do what we're doing because we know what we're talking about. But the other side of this, he pointed out, is that if you're a relativist, you also think that you are insulated from criticism, or your culture is, because whatever you think is right for you. And if other people come along and they say, well, I'm not so sure about the way you're living, your answer to that is, in effect, well, that may be fine for you, but not for me. And so we all just, like, insulate ourselves in our little worldviews. But I think maybe the challenge, like the other side of this, is that debating these things can be terrifying. I wonder if this is a thing that maybe puts people off of philosophy classes sometimes. That, like, a philosophy, like, if you take a philosophy class, you kind of know, if you go to philosophy talks, like where philosophers give a lecture and then there's a Q&A session, the Q&A sessions are, relative to what other disciplines look like, extremely aggressive. Like, people tell other people that they are wrong. And I think that one thing, at least, that's going on with a lot of my students in my ethics classes is that they don't want to tell other people that they're wrong. But I guess in a way I think we have to do some version of that. Maybe not tell them they're wrong, but raise the question whether perhaps they might be. Where that doesn't assume that I know what I'm talking about. But also doesn't assume that they're right, or that we just, this is all just a matter of opinion. And so this is the way that this kind of question often turns up, is that, like, well, different people have different views about what the good life is, and some people, like, really want to have, like, really nice shiny things, and some people are okay with having less and just hanging out with friends. And to each their own. And we, in the extreme version, it really is the kind of thing where, like, we can't even have a conversation about this. So I think I would be interested in hearing from both of you about how you think about having conversations about these various things, where you do find that people don't necessarily agree with you about whatever kinds of things you found yourself disagreeing with people about.
It's a good question, and it's a hard one, because I think it also depends on the nature of the disagreement. If we're disagreeing about, is Rocky Road ice cream better than butterscotch ice cream? I mean, that doesn't really matter, but there are other things that really do matter. You can think about the debates that took place a couple years ago about vaccines or masks. I mean, people really had strong opinions about that, and it created huge divisions within families and with communities, that the mask somehow became this political pawn. So as a psychologist, I tend to approach those kinds of things, or I try to anyway, and again, depending on the issue, it's not always so easy, but I try to approach it with curiosity. There are reasons people believe things, even if people are wrong. There's a reason why people subscribe to a particular way of thinking. And so I think that if we can detach ourselves a little bit from the issue and try to bring curiosity, well, what may have led this person to believe that? What set of experiences may they have had that led them to draw that conclusion? And perhaps had I been brought up or had a set of experiences that led me to that, might I, adopt those same ideas? I think that if we can approach it from a place of empathy and compassion, I think that it's going to at least be I think that we're going to live a little bit easier and a little bit more peacefully if we can approach it from that perspective. But again, it's very much easier said than done. But there was something else that I wanted to tack onto that, but it has escaped me. I'll see if it comes back. But I think that bringing a place of curiosity is what I personally try to do in those situations.
Yeah, that's great. The two words that came to mind, or collection of words that came to mind when you asked this question, Nick, was first humility, a posture of humility, and second, a spirit of inquiry. And I think those, curiosity, I think we're speaking similar language here. If both sides were to take that tack of curiosity or humility and inquiry, it would make a very big difference than if both sides were trying to prove the other wrong and themselves right. You still have the problem of what is truth, right? Who is right, and does that matter? I'm an ethicist, and I'm an ethicist in a hospital where often the decisions for what is right and what is wrong have life and death consequences. Is it ethical, for example, to remove a ventilator from a patient who is no longer able to express her own wishes because the medical team thinks that she has zero quality of life and will never leave the hospital? Removing that ventilator isn't the direct cause of her death. The direct cause of her death is her underlying disease. However, we can often be quite certain that her disease will advance quite quickly to death once that ventilator is removed. Those are the kinds of questions that I'm called in to make on a daily basis in our hospital. And we have to know what is right and wrong. Sometimes the answers are legal, and so what is ethical is not always legal, and what is illegal is not always ethical. But we have to ask those questions, and so I think, Nick, where you're going is getting to these bigger life questions. At some point, some of us in this room are going to think that our own belief systems, whatever they are right, and others are wronged, that we have truth and others don't or are misguided. And what do you do about that? On some level, on all levels, I think it's absolutely, even saying this is an absolute statement. I'm finding myself making an absolute statement about something absolute, but it's absolutely expected to hold truth claims. And if anyone thinks that it isn't, I could pull out a couple of particularly nauseating examples where no one in this room would say, oh no, that's acceptable, right? You can just think of any forms of heinous abuse. No one's going to say those are acceptable. Okay, so if we can agree on particularly heinous things as being unacceptable or wrong or evil, or you pick your word, why do we come to those perspectives? Why do we hold these as values? Is it just because it's dehumanizing? And then I could say, well, there are many aspects of modern life that are equally dehumanizing. The way, well, there's so many different ways that are dehumanizing but are legal, right? So what do we do about that? And this is, going back to what does it mean to live well in order to die well? I think wrestling with these questions in a posture of humility, in a spirit of curiosity and inquiry, hopefully will, in a community of people seeking, will hopefully lend itself toward finding answers. And I think that's part of the spirit of these conversations that Veritas Forum holds, to try to seek truth together. So I think it's part of the life work, certainly part of the college work.
I remember what I was where I left off.
Yeah, go for it.
And I love the way that you frame that. Yeah, I think that we all are trying to seek truth, but we have different experiences that lead us down different paths that lead us to draw different conclusions. But maybe it was one little turn that could have led us on a very different path. I think that the other idea that popped into my head is that to the question of what about when there's a higher stakes issue where someone is right or someone is wrong? In my experience, when someone is wrong about something, and I'm pretty sure that they're wrong about something, the way that they're going to change their mind, I can't imagine a scenario where someone who is wrong about something suddenly changes their mind because I tell them that they're wrong. As a behavioral scientist, what the evidence would suggest is that people don't change their mind because someone tells them, you're wrong about that, you shouldn't think that, but rather people change their mind about something through experience. When they have an opportunity to see things in a different way or to walk in somebody's shoes, or if they hold certain ideas about people of a particular group or background or identity, well, sometimes it's having experiences with those people that can sort of disabuse some of the notions that may have led them to conclusions that turn out not to be as true as they thought. So that's another thing. In those particular moments, I think If I can tell that someone has a deep-seated conviction about something, that I see something differently, I'm not perfect about this, but I try to take a step back and bring curiosity and compassion to that, and then also think about, well, if I do want to go through the effort of encouraging them to think a different way, it's not going to be based on what I tell them, but rather are there ways I can introduce them to experiences that can at least allow them to see things from the vantage point that I personally am experiencing something.
And I think for those of you who have read the Socratic dialogues, you see that Socrates does this so well. I keep turning it back to you for philosophy, but Socrates does this so well, right? Where he starts out by asking a question and then asking another question and asking another question and helping people see perhaps the fallacy in their reasoning. And so we can do it again. This requires the curiosity and the compassion, the humility and the inquiry, but we can help. If we really feel that someone is in error, as good friends, it probably behooves us to help them see that error, and doing that through sort of a meaningful dialogue can be one way to do it as well.
One of the ways in which he's an amazing example is I think it's fair to say that he was absolutely certain that there was a truth, especially about ethics. He was also absolutely certain that he did not know what it was. And that's where he begins in the Socratic dialogues, is with the thought that, like, I don't know, and I'm gonna go ask other people and see if they know. And he tends to find that they don't seem to know either. But he, and this is like, it's hard to read him in this way sometimes, given how the dialogues are written, but I think I would like to read it in such a way that he genuinely really wants to know if they have the truth. Because he knows he doesn't, and he knows it's out there. And what else are you going to do but find out? So in the spirit of asking questions, I want to turn things over here to questions from the audience. And I think to do this, I'm going to pass this microphone to Jamie here. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and Jamie will come around.
Hi there. So my question is related to what you were discussing earlier about the importance of keeping salient in our minds the fact that we will die, that we have a finite amount of time, and that we should really think about that in order to have gratitude for the time that we do have remaining. I think I'm the kind of person who really values gratitude, but I find that it's really easy to slip from a place of feeling grateful to feeling existential fear at the thought of our mortality when we keep in our minds the fact that we will die. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can simultaneously keep that thought in mind, practice gratitude, but avoid falling down that rabbit hole of, I only have so much time left, and that's terrifying.
Oh, is your question sort of predicated on the idea that gratitude is because we have finite time? So I'm going to be grateful because time is precious, and so therefore I better savor it? Is that kind of what your question is?
Possibly. I'm not sure. I guess I didn't think about it that way previously. I definitely think that's part of it. I don't know if that's necessarily what I'm saying, but I guess that kind of dichotomy is interesting to me. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me like your question, it's a great question, by the way. And I think that, people experience gratitude in a lot of different ways. And I think that if we're expressing gratitude because we feel like we have to, or because, well, I guess maybe this will sort of resolve the dilemma I'm facing when I think about my own mortality, or this is my way as an escape hatch from an existential crisis, I'm not sure that we're really using gratitude for its proper purpose. I mean, I think about gratitude simply as taking time to direct our attention to good things in our lives that we may simply otherwise have taken for granted. We seem to be hardwired with what psychologists call a negative-positive asymmetry effect, where our mind automatically tends to go to negative things. We ruminate on all the problems of our day. We could have 100 good things go on in our life, but then we get one bad grade on a test, or we have a disagreement with a roommate, and we are replaying that one thing and losing sight of all the good things. I think about gratitude in its purest form as simply a matter of redirecting attention to the good things that are out there that we may have otherwise taken for granted, or that we have habituated to because the mind is more attuned to the negative things. So that's personally I think what I try to use as a practice of gratitude is, what are some of the good things in my life that have just sort of, that aren't as salient on my radar as some other things?
Maybe if I can just jump in from the medical doctor perspective, I've had a number of physicians who are reluctant to tell patients when they're dying. And I asked one of my colleagues, why don't you like to tell patients this? And she said, I never tell patients when they're dying because I myself am so afraid to die. And yet all of us will, right? So there's a poet, Christian Wyman is his name, and Chris Wyman was diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer. And so as a poet, he's sort of living with this cancer, married, has kids, and is thinking about this. At some point, any point, this could come back. And he talks about the need to lean in or to press in, to actually, he uses the language, walk toward the fear and the sadness. And so if the very thought of mortality, just some far out there at some point mortality, fills anybody with such existential dread, then how do you sort of walk toward that? And that's where that's part of the work of living well, right? That's one of the tasks of living well, is to work out answers to those questions in the context of communities, people you love and trust. There's been tons written about this since the beginning of recorded history, right? So it's not that we have to reinvent all of these big questions, but dig in a little bit to the ways that people have thought about these questions and wrestled with them, and see what resonates and makes sense with you. But working out how we make sense of those questions is really part of living well, so that it doesn't have to be this big, scary unknown for us. But it can be that when our time is up, we can, in a sense, die in peace, right? Rest in peace. There's the peace part, the fact that peace has long been part of that narrative for death suggests that working out our answers to some of these existential questions is part of it.
Hi, and thank you so much. This is slightly off topic, but this question is something which baffles me. Sometimes I wonder that in certain religious scripts, it's mentioned that you need to be meek, and even in the Bible, it's mentioned that the meek shall inherit the earth. And in the world of business, it's completely different. You need to be assertive. Recently, like CEOs, they say that if you want a seat at the table, pull up a chair. Assert yourself. All the world leaders that I see in this world today. So there are these two schools of thought. There are more, but usually these are the ones that dominate. Should you bend, or should you stand tall as a tree? Should you change, or should you cause change? And I sometimes oscillate between these two, and I sometimes wonder which is the right way forward.
So let me just make sure I can repeat back to you the question. So there are two different schools of thought. There's the biblical injunction that the meek shall inherit the earth, and then there's the CEOs who say, if you want a seat at the table, pull up a chair. So sort of meekness, or the path of humility, contrasted with self-assertiveness, playing the game, if you will. And was your final question there, like, how do we think about these contrasting visions for life? Or
I find both these schools to work. They say that if you think you deserve the universe, usually you'll get it. So the assertive thing also works. And the religious scriptures also, they seem to work as well. If you're meek, and usually you get what's coming to you, even if you're meek or something. You don't need to assert. So I find both these schools of thought to work to get where you are, or to get where you need to be. But I just wonder, what is the right way forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that's a really great question. So we have different roles in life. This is the way I've been thinking about this. We have different roles. And I thought, this struck me very early on when, as a very junior professor, I was asked to lead essentially a meeting that was full of very senior physicians. And the first time I led the meeting, I did not sit at the head of the table. Probably the first couple of times, I sort of sat kind of tucked 1/3 of the way down. I felt intimidated. I was young. These men were they were mostly men. They were more than double my age. I felt that but I had been asked to lead the meeting, and actually from a content perspective, I was the most expert in the room because I was leading a meeting on something I worked on. But yet I felt a certain amount of intimidation. And then one day I woke up and said, in this context, I walk in and I take a seat at the table. I'm leading this meeting. Now that doesn't mean that in that context of leadership and needing to assert one's authority, that one lacks humility or these other virtues that different traditions might laud and that we here might agree are good, generosity, gratitude. But different roles in life demand that we behave in certain ways. I'm a parent. The way I manage my teenage girls might be very different in different contexts. Then, I might be much more taking a seat at the table, taking charge, because that's what I have to do to parent and to discipline in certain contexts. So what I would hope, though, is that the characters that we cultivate, right, those virtues, the traits that we want to be known for, the traits that we value as a society or from our religious traditions, our religious texts, our sacred texts, that those traits would be consistent, or that we could sort of aim for consistency no matter what the role is. Does that make sense? So I'm distinguishing between, you could still be a meek CEO might sound like but you could be a CEO who is characterized by a regard and a concern for those entrusted to his care. You could certainly be that kind of CEO. So I think maybe trying to distinguish character traits or virtues or habits from particular roles might be a helpful way to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think that was extremely well said. I think the only thing I might add is what popped into my mind as you were asking that question is one of the things that people talk about in psychology is how we conceptualize self-esteem. And there are many different pillars around self-esteem. And one of them is the idea of self-assertiveness. That people who have high self-esteem have typically taken the time to really reflect on what's important to them, their values. They have a direction of where they're heading. But I don't know that the idea of pulling up a seat at the table is mutually exclusive with having humility and compassion and care for those around you. I think that you can have a seat at the table and have direction and be assertive, but also in a way that you introduce a certain level of humility. I think about some of the leaders of this university. I mean, James McLeod was the dean when I was an undergraduate, and he was known for that. I mean, he was the most kind, soft-spoken, gentle person, but he was a man on a mission. It was clear. I mean, the undergraduate experience that we have here was built because of his vision, and he clearly had an idea of where he wanted to head. But one-on-one, he was just this wonderful, kind, patient person. And so I believe that it is possible to be assertive and also someone who is kind and compassionate and meek as well. I don't know that those two have to be one or the other.
Hello. So when you brought up your coworker being just deathly afraid of death, not wanting to talk about it and how that has impacted the way she approaches the topic of death with her patients as well. In my experience, I've been more of someone who likes to confront death or likes to think about it, thinks it's healthy in a lot of forms to think about it, but I'm never, I could never imagine really helping someone confront their fear of death, especially if they're very close to it. I can imagine maybe having a friend who I don't think is gonna die very soon and talking through topics with them, but when you have a patient who is deathly afraid of death, what do you do? Do you tend to sort of, do you think it's a harm almost to make them confront that, or do you think it's always good?
This is where thinking through language is really helpful. So I'm a primary care doctor in one of my roles, and I've taken care of thousands and thousands of patients, and one of the requirements of Medicare is that for every patient who comes in for an annual, I ask that patient if they would like to talk about end-of-life wishes. And my patients in the waiting room all have a checklist to fill out with getting some background information, and that question, would you like to speak with your doctor about end-of-life wishes, invariably they all check no. So they come in for their appointment, and I glance down and I see that they all check no, right? This patient again checks no, and I say, all right, Mrs. Smith, I know you don't want to talk about end-of-life wishes. I see you checked no, but can I just ask you one question? It's flu season, it's COVID, it's whatever. If you get so sick that you cannot make medical decisions for yourself, with whom should I speak to make those decisions? Because we'll need somebody to make your decisions. Oh, you want it to be your spouse. Great. Have you spoken with your spouse about how you think about these sorts of questions related to the hospital and illness? What do you mean? She says. And then I start talking about things like ventilators, DNR orders, do not resuscitate orders, dialysis, sort of put some of those things out on the table. And then it builds from there, because I have to see my patients at least every year for this annual visit, many of them more often. Then little by little, the conversation advances. And the conversation can advance to, okay, so last year when we talked about this, you said you would never want X, Y, and Z. How are you thinking about things now? What are the conversations you've had with your family? How are you feeling more broadly about questions of living and dying? And I often put living and dying together, because even people who receive terminal diagnoses are still alive. They're still living, right? And so there's a way in which we can have conversations with them about what gives them hope, right? How are they oriented toward the good, even in light of this devastating news? They're still good. Some people say as long as you're alive, there's hope. Probably trite, another one of these things. But as long as they are alive, we can talk about how can we, in light of these circumstances, still orient towards the good, and what would that mean? And I've seen all kinds of things as a doc. I've seen incredible relational reconciliation. I've also seen people die with their relationships in a really bad way. But the relational reconciliation is probably some of the most powerful things I've witnessed. The letters that people write when they receive diagnoses. A dear friend of mine, when she found out she was dying, she wrote letters to her children that they would receive every year on their birthday until they turned 18. I mean, it's incredible to think about doing that work in advance. Really powerful, right? Really powerful. But people are willing to go there. The other thing I'll say is that I have found, so out of thousands and thousands of patients with whom I've had these conversations, fewer than 5 have completely lost their stuff when I've brought up end of life. Fewer than 5. Most people want permission to talk about it, they just don't know how to get started. Research shows that people are more comfortable talking to their kids about sex than they are talking to their adult parents about end of life wishes. So people are really afraid, but as a doc, if I just open it up gently, have you thought about this? Who should I call? First question, who should I call if you're too sick? Second question, does that person know what you think? Third question, do you know what you think? Is an easy way to sort of get in the door, and then permission is granted.
Hi, great discussion. Since I have the liberty of speaking to people from a faith-based organization, having just recited the Nicene Creed before I came over, just to make sure I had that nailed. But the thing that makes me happiest in life is being in the presence of someone who has been born again, who has become a Christian and has this life and death issue settled so they can get on with being happy. That's all I have to say.
Can I just say something really quickly? So I don't know that every person who identifies as religious necessarily has that question settled. And the reason why I say this is because, so I write on end-of-life stuff, and the Methodists in the 1700s were really into recording the deathbed scene. And they had a whole publication that they would circulate that had people's, it wasn't your CV, it wasn't your typical obituary, it was really the deathbed scene. How did he die? And why did they do that? Because they wanted to try to do that to encourage the faithful that this is what a good death looks like. The problem is that it put a lot of pressure on people to get it right. And there were people who belonged to the Methodist community, but hadn't made their peace. There was the teaching, but they hadn't embraced it in their hearts. And so that practice gradually fell out of favor, and that publication stopped circulating. But I think that this is a good example, though, of the need, to the earlier question, the need to sort of wrestle with these existential questions. And I think to do it until we come to answers that give us sort of authentic, deep peace, and not just sort of giving lip service to what we've been taught. So I just want to make that distinction, if that's okay.
I just want to focus in on like one aspect of what Forum has like titled it, which is about seeking meaning in like a limited life. You definitely touched on it with emphasis on the importance of relationships and expressing gratitude. But I was wondering if you could expand it more on how we should seek meaning in our life.
Oh, okay, so if I'm understanding your question, it's kind of a more broad, like how do we seek meaning in our lives? Is that kind of a good way to summarize the question?
Sure, that's a good way.
Okay, all right, well, I'll start and you can let me know if I've taken this in a different direction than you had intended. It's difficult to answer that in part because meaning means different things to different people. And I think that at any given time, we sort of have to be like our own behavioral scientists and sort of try things out. And that's where I think that the power of pausing and reflecting on life, on where are we putting our greatest time, effort, and energy, and what is that leading us to, both in the short term and in the long term. That's where I think that we can really extract some value in paying attention to that. You know, we've evolved this wonderfully complex set of emotions for a reason. They provide us cues to our internal states, and I think that it's worthwhile to listen to that. And also, it underscores the importance of surrounding ourselves with community, because sometimes other people see things in us. You're spending a lot of time like this, or you haven't been yourself, or you're always stressed out when you're with this person. What's going on there? I think that can often be a clue into how are we spending our time. Is that leading us in a place that we want to go? And is there just some internal sense that this just feels right? Which scientists hate that because you can't quantify it. You can't put it like in a petri dish and measure it. But I think that there is something to that of just how am I feeling about where my life is headed and how my activities are playing out? And are there opportunities to maybe modify things and see if that leads to a different outcome?
Just quickly, I don't know if you want to jump in on this. All right, let me just say something quickly, and then I'm going to pass it to the philosopher. We just finished reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl with our medical students. Yeah? Have you read it recently?
Yeah, one of my favorites.
Yeah. It's great. But, you know, Frankl makes the point, right? He's a psychologist in the concentration camps, right? In the death camps, the Nazi death camps, and lives through it, right? And he was I feel like you guys would be pals, right?
I read the book as a student here, yes.
Yeah, he was really interested in this question of how meaning keeps people alive. Because it was the people who no longer had meaning who didn't have hope and then died. And sometimes they died by suicide in the camps, but sometimes they just literally gave up life. I mean, so many people were already at the close brink of death anyway, because circumstances were just so devastating. But the two things that really strike me about that book, one is, three things. First is relationships, right? And that's come up a lot this evening. The way that relationships give us meaning, right? We, human beings, are meant to be in relationship. Full stop, right? That's just true. That's true. Challenge me on it. The second thing is service. So it's very clear that when they could find opportunities to serve one another in the camps, despite the adversity of their circumstances, that gave them meaning. And then the third way that Frankl's a little bit more subtle about, but comes through in small ways, is his relationship to God. So the divine, right? The religious life, who we are in relationship to the divine, gives us meaning. And those are three things that strike me as being true in the concentration camps and the death camps, but probably are also make sense for us today to think about them. But I'm going to hand it over to the philosopher.
I don't have a lot to say. I tried to give a talk about this at the end of last semester, around the same time this semester, actually, I think. And Orly, who just asked the question, was at the talk, and I think afterwards she was among students asking me questions that made me realize that I hadn't said what I wanted to say. But I think what Tim was saying about experimentation, I think that's something that I find in this moment now is really resonating with me. I think I don't know that I know yet what is meaningful to me exactly. There are things that work and there are things that really like help me get through from one day to another. These include weirdly things like cooking every day and even doing the dishes. These like routines and habits. And then, I mean, things like I sit every single morning of my life and I drink coffee and I read something because I love that. Now that might not work for you. Not everyone loves reading as much as some of us. But I think like, I like the idea of just like trying things and not letting yourself like get stuck into things that aren't working. Like try out new things, see what happens, and what works for you, what gives your life meaning is what gives your life meaning. And I can't think of anything better to say than like experiment, figure it out. I don't know, maybe share tips, but that seemed like really, really good advice to me.